So as we've been sharing a contemporary word of wisdom and also a historical word of wisdom. Our contemporary word today comes from Haruki Murakami, a Japanese author who wrote this. And this has to do with the story we're going to tell from the Gospel of Matthew about Jesus in the storm. He writes, "Once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You may not even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain. When you come out, you won't be the same person who walked in." And here's a more historical word of wisdom, this from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, beginning in verse 18. So I invite you to listen in these words to the Spirit's word to you and to the church in this time. "Now when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. A scribe then approached him and said, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.' Another of the disciples said to him, 'Lord, first let me go and bury my father.' But Jesus said to him, 'Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead.' When he got into the boat, the disciples followed him. And a windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But Jesus was asleep. And they went and woke him. They said, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid, you of little faith?' And then he got up, and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. And they were amazed, saying, 'What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" Holy wisdom, holy word, thanks be to God. So I think that many of you know by now that typically I tend to prepare my sermon at rather the last minute. Now, I'm not going to say quite how last minute because I recognize that may give some people anxiety. But let's just say I have rarely found myself with a completed draft any earlier than Saturday night. Sunday morning, I'm usually still polishing. And I've gotten a lot of flack from people over the years for this practice, some of it probably justified, but especially from my colleagues who write their sermons a week, some of them even several weeks ahead of time. Now, I'm sure that they enjoy their Saturday nights a lot more than I do. I will give them that. But my question to them so often is, how do you do it? How do you do it living in this country today, in this world today? How do you plan so far ahead when it seems more and more that we never know on Monday of any given week what tragedy might befall us by the time Sunday dawns? I wonder how many times they've had to rewrite the words they have prepared in these last years. I know if I had prepared ahead, there would have been many during my ministry, even just my ministry in this church. In the last 6.5 years, there have been mass shootings and school shootings and police shootings. There has been Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Ahmaud Audrey and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There was Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston and Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and the mosques in Christchurch. And now to these tragedies, we add the 8 lives lost in the massacres in Atlanta this week, 6 of them Asian women. And sometimes, I have to say, I just feel as though we are drowning in violence and that we will never get our head above the water of our own prejudice. Every time this comes around, I spend the last days of the week and Saturday late into the night trying to understand, trying to make sense, trying to see the matters of race and of history at play. I don't want to, but I force myself to try to recognize and then repent of the ways the Christian faith is operational in so many of these tragedies. The message of Jesus warped in order to support violence and nationalism and racial supremacy and damaging sexual ideas. I hear someone crying, "We are perishing." And I try as hard as I can to be honest about whether I am truly in the boat with them or simply another wave swamping them in their desperation. And I gotta tell you, it's not easy work. Especially because I have this one very significant limitation. Now, luckily, it's one that we all share, so perhaps it will be useful for you to know how I cope with it. And my limitation is this. I have only inhabited the world in this one single body. I've never had another. Perhaps if you figure that out, you could let me know. I have only moved around the world in this one singular, white, female, cisgender, and by that I mean that my biological sex at birth matches the gender I know myself to be, body. It's all I've got. And I don't know what it's like to walk around the world in any other kind of body. I don't know what it's like to be a black woman, for instance, or a Latina, or a gay man, or a transgendered man, or an Asian American woman. I don't have those experiences. And so when things happen to other types of bodies, I cannot immediately assume that I know or understand the full meaning of them. I cannot assume that if I were to imagine my body in the place of theirs in the same situation, that things would be completely clear to me. Does that make any sense? Like, it's not a one-to-one equation. I cannot expect to understand things that happen based solely on my own experience because I have not had all of the experiences of living in the world in these different types of bodies. And so I need to be very circumspect. I need to work harder. I need to try to understand the broader context of other bodies and how they are seen and treated and touched and described and portrayed. I can do this, of course, through my own hard work and learning. It's often what I'm doing late in the hours on Saturday. And sometimes, too, when others are generous to share, I can learn by hearing and by believing the stories which are entrusted to me by those who have lived their lives in different kinds of bodies. Stories which are always a gift, the giver's choice to give, and, as they are never to be deserved, a grace to receive. And let me tell you that the stories that I heard this week from my Asian American friends and colleagues were chillingly uniform in their reaction to the troubling events that unfolded in Georgia. And that was, this is nothing new. The idea that someone would see Asian women as dispensable wares, objects of little value, their deaths a reasonable price to pay to discharge some personal or sexual discomfort, that is not a new idea. Many Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander women live every day at this dangerous intersection of racism and misogyny, coping with burdensome and harmful stereotypes of submission and temptation and foreignness and availability. And though among my friends, thankfully none have experienced violence to the degree we saw this week in Atlanta, the fact of those events seems to have struck them like a tuning fork, finding resonance at the deepest parts of them, surfacing difficult memories and deep fears. And I am trying my best to understand. And if you are not Asian or Asian American or a Pacific Islander woman, I hope that you have spent this week trying to understand that too. And I hope that you are doing your best with courage and sensitivity to care for and uplift those in your circles who may be especially suffering right now, understanding that they don't owe you a response to your outreach, but that it is worthwhile to communicate that you want to be in the boat together. And speaking of that, I've been thinking so much about this boat metaphor this week. I just feel like I'm turning it around in my mind like a prism as I've been following recent events. And I have to say that I never actually really understood what the connection between these two anecdotes that follow each other in the Gospel of Matthew is all about. But I think now I might. And I think it has to do with the question of who is in the boat. So maybe you caught it, and I know maybe we might have had the wrong text. I think that was my mistake. But in the first story we heard, Jesus has just finished teaching these large crowds, and lots of different people are coming to him and saying, I want to follow you. And Jesus is saying, there is no place for the Son of Man to lay his head. As in, this journey will not be comfortable, and it will not be easy, and it may not be restful. It will take you far beyond what is familiar, and there will be real risks along the road. And still they come, Jesus, I want to follow you. One says, Jesus, I want to follow you. I just need to do this one really important thing first, which is to bury my father who has died. And Jesus says, leave him and come now. As in, you must leave behind things, even things which seem of great import, because this is greater and the time has come. And then the very next scene, there they are in the boat. Those that did make the choice to follow Jesus are there, and there's a storm. As if Jesus' warning that the way may not be easy is immediately proved. They're in the storm. They're being swamped. There is a cry. We are perishing. Will you not save us? So, who's in the boat? That's my question for this story. I think we all know from stories of his ministries in all the Gospels that in the boat with Jesus, metaphorically at least, are always the vulnerable and the lost and the marginalized and certainly the victimized. But I think these two stories linked together tell us that also there are the ones willing to make the hard choice, to accept some discomfort, to set aside the dead things, the dead ideas and the dead perspectives, maybe even the dead beliefs that can only lead to more death. I think the message is that if you're not on this journey of self-transformation, then you are standing on the shore. But in the boat are those who are willing to let go of themselves in a certain way in order to grasp the larger life that is offered to them in the journey with Jesus, which of course is God's reign of love and justice. Now, it is not easy. That's the promise. There is peril, certainly, and great risks. There are real things to fear out there. But guess who else is in the boat? Jesus is in the boat. Maybe you missed that. Jesus is in the boat. Now, maybe you find it perplexing, as I often have, that Jesus chastises the disciples for their fear in the face of the storm. I get a little uncomfortable reading this part of the story. This is not the kind Jesus in the Sunday school stories. He's angry with them for being afraid. And I've never understood that. Reading the story now, I see that his rebuke isn't necessarily about their recognition of the threat. I think it's about their ignorance of the power that they have at their disposal to face that threat. Jesus is in the boat with them. The same Jesus that cured the lepers and healed the blind, the same Jesus who fed the crowds and raised people from the dead, there is power in their boat. Immense power. And though it may at times seem to be sleeping, to deny its presence is a grievous transgression. And so here is just what I want to say to you today. We too have power in our boat. And it's time to stop denying it. I think this is true of the troubles we face today in our country, also the difficulties that we each face in our everyday lives. We have power with us. Maybe at times it's obscured or its workings unfamiliar to us, but we do have power. We simply need to figure out how to wake it up. To be clear, I am saying that I think we have power to combat racism in this country, and that we have power to combat sexism in this country, to awaken the potential of justice among us. Now, we haven't done it yet. No, we have not. We haven't yelled loud enough to wake it up, but I think we've come close a few times. I think we've shouted and stomped enough to make it stir, and so what I think we need to do now is to keep on going, to recruit more voices. I believe we have spiritual power, the power of the God of love and the God of mercy. I think we have that power within and among us. I also think we have earthly power to deploy, our voices, our votes, our actions, our stories, our witness. I think if we are honest, we admit that we can face whatever storm comes for us. Of course, we have to be willing to make some tough choices. We have to be willing to let go of some things we might hold really dear. We must have the courage to be willing to lose sight of the shore of the familiar and strike out toward the far horizon of a new vision that has not yet come fully into view. Certainly, we'll have to learn to develop some better flow among paddlers with different bodies and different experiences and different traditions. But ultimately, I do believe that we have the power to create, if we would choose it, little by little, a new reality, the one Jesus pointed us to. This a reality in which more than the privileged few can trust that from Monday to Sunday, justice and peace and dignity will remain intact. We have power. I think that's what Jesus' ministry was meant to proclaim, certainly his healing ministry. I think it's also what his death meant to prove. He that put his body in the most painful and difficult place that all might find liberation through it, promises us that if we lash ourselves to the God of love, that hatred and oppression and even death won't have power over us anymore. That's the hope that I keep returning to every Saturday night, even after all these storms. That's the place I keep getting to, just this idea that we need to keep getting in the boat with one another. And certainly with the one who doesn't judge us, who didn't judge the outcasts or the sex workers of his day, but in fact welcome them to the table. Welcome their bodies and their stories, trusting that God does that with us, that God will welcome me too. And so I dedicate these words and these invitations in the name of that God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always, and who still